Jon Snow stood atop the rugged battlements of Winterfell, the chill wind biting into his cheeks as if it meant to etch its mark upon him forever. A hush had fallen over the courtyard behind him, where the countless men and women who had pledged themselves to his cause waited in anxious silence. Usually, the eaves of the fortress would be awash in the low hum of conversation or the clang of metal upon metal, but that day, breath itself seemed muted. For rumors had swept across the north. An army was coming, an army such as few living souls had ever beheld. He had known battles enough to set his nerves on a razor's edge. He had heard stories from Old Nan and from Tormund Giantsbane alike. Giants roamed the far edges of the world, said to be savage, unstoppable, as large as the hateful mountains that loomed beyond the wall. True or not, something stirring in the far north was making its way toward Winterfell. He had heard rumors of the groaning thunder of giant footsteps, of the wind swirling in ghostly cyclones of snow, revealing shapes far mightier than men. And, if the reports from Tormund's wildling scouts were accurate, this was no small band. This was a host, gargantuan in size, united in some common purpose. The watchers on Winterfell's walls had reported signs of travelers in the distance, but on a scale that beggared belief. Monstrous footprints pressed into the snow, making the ground tremble. Figures taller than the highest oak. They heard them long before the gate horns announced their arrival. Great, low rumbles that shook even the ancient stones of the fortress. Giants, dozens, perhaps well over 100, accompanied by wildlings and mammoths. It sounded impossible, like a child's fable made real. Yet here it was on this day of grim winter. The sky darkened with the gloom of an early twilight, a sign of a rising storm. Jon's black cloak and thick furs offered scant comfort, though he had grown accustomed to the cold. He was no stranger to the biting winds that howled through the north, but this chill seemed to carry a more ominous weight. Even the Karstark men, tall and unflinching in their sturdy leather and iron, exchanged uneasy glances from the ramparts. The swirling wind flayed what little warmth remained in the air. Each breath Jon took felt thin and tight. At his shoulder, Ser Davos Seaworth stood, rubbing his hands together to stir warmth into stiffening fingers. Though Davos was a knight, raised by Stannis Baratheon long ago, he had little love for formalities. "My lord," he said softly, voice scarcely more than a mutter against the wind. "Should we send forth a greeting party, or wait and see if this is truly the company Tormund promised?" Jon swallowed the dryness in his throat. "We wait," he said, measuring his words carefully. "If Tormund is right, these giants have come to talk. They may be here to join us, but let's confirm first. We show them no fear, but we also show no hostility. A delicate balance, Davos." Davos nodded. "Aye, the men below. Some are half convinced these giants will pound down our walls the moment we open the gate." "We won't cower," Jon said, steeling himself, "but we'll be ready, in case Tormund's word doesn't hold." He peered down into the courtyard, where those loyal to the Stark name had gathered in tense clusters. They all knew something unprecedented was about to take place. Giants marching into Winterfell's domain was the stuff of nursery tales, not daily life. And yet Tormund Giantsbane, broad-chested and red-bearded, was among them, gesticulating with vigor as he assured the watchmen that the guests approaching were indeed friendly, or at least not openly hostile. Jon's thoughts flickered back to his earliest days on the wall, to his first glimpse of a giant. Even one such creature had been a terrifying wonder, an echo of an older world. Now a multitude was coming. He saw them in his mind. Massive silhouettes in the snow, mammoths in tow, carrying with them the raw primal power of the far north. The idea that they would willingly venture this far south hinted at something dire pushing them onward. Or perhaps they had found something, someone they deemed worthy to follow. The horns resounded again, forlorn notes echoing across the courtyard. All heads turned northward to the bleached horizon. They came in a slow-moving line, the land seeming to yield under their mighty footsteps. Even from this vantage, Jon felt a tremor, as though the earth was aware of these ancient beings. Mammoths trudged in their midst, snorting plumes of steam into the gray air. their tusks curved like scythe blades. A handful of wildlings, dwarfed by these companions, rode astride the mammoths or strode in the giants' towering footprints. Jon's heart pounded like a drum. He had seen battle, seen the dead rise, faced unspeakable horrors. Yet this spectacle stirred an awe in him he could not suppress. The scale of it, the raw, unbridled sense of power, was unlike anything he had known. The stony silence of the watchers said it all. Men were not used to feeling so small. Below, Tormund turned and yelled something that the wind carried away, but Jon could guess. Open the gates. No doubt, along with a healthy helping of colorful language. Jon nodded at Davos, who signaled the gatekeepers. With a grinding of chains, Winterfell's heavy doors rumbled and parted. Jon made his way down the ramp, joining Tormund near the threshold. Tormund's face was flushed from wind and excitement. "Took you long enough, Snow?" he growled good-naturedly. "But here they are, just as I said. They'll want food, drink, a warm hearth. Not that you can give 'em all a bed inside, mind you." Jon forced a tense laugh. "We'll do what we can. Let's just hope they come peacefully." Even as he spoke, the first giant ducked through the gate arch, stooping to fit beneath the great wooden beams. It stood tall, its furred garb caked with ice and snow, hair matted in thick ropes, a face that was half bestial, half sorrowful, eyes set deeply behind a heavy brow. The creature's breath came in great huffs of steam. It looked down at Jon Snow, looked down at everyone, with an air of curiosity, as though it had wandered into the abode of children. Behind it, more giants followed, each seemingly broader and taller than the last, until Winterfell's courtyard was crowded with forms too large to be contained by any mortal structure. Some carried clubs fashioned from tree trunks. Others had makeshift axes. Mammoths lumbered alongside, guided by wildlings who called out in rough encouragement. A hush fell over the onlookers, as if each mortal was collectively holding their breath in the presence of legends come to life. Jon advanced, shoulders square, refusing to let fear show on his face. The lead giant peered at him, nostrils flaring. Its voice emerged as a thunderous rumble, a tongue of grunts and guttural phrases. Jon caught fragments reminiscent of the old tongue Tormund had tried to teach him. He turned a questioning glance to Tormund, who stepped up. "He says," Tormund began, "they come in peace. They'll stay if we let them. They're tired from the long march." He spat on the ground, his breath mingling with the swirling snow. "Let them rest, Snow. We promised them some courtesy, at least." Jon nodded. "We'll offer them bread and salt, by the old custom." At once, a handful of northern stewards rushed forward, tray-bearers trembling despite themselves. They offered bread and salt, the sign of guest right. The giant carefully pinched some of the offerings between two fingers as large as a man's wrist, and popped them into its mouth. A low, contented grunt sounded, neither pleased nor displeased, but simply acknowledging. The watchers exhaled in tentative relief, and so the courtyard filled. Giants sank onto their haunches, grateful to ease their colossal limbs after a punishing journey. Mammoths huffed, stomping in place to rid themselves of the chill. Tormund barked orders to the wildlings and to the stewards alike, making it plain that no one was to provoke these new guests. Ser Davos hovered nearby, face drawn in cautious wonder. His single good hand hovered near his sword, not in threat but as if for reassurance. Overhead, the gray sky churned, sending fresh snow to cloak men and giants alike. Long into that twilight, as fresh fires were lit and makeshift accommodations prepared, Jon drifted among these towering newcomers. Some of the braver men tried stilted conversation, aided by wildlings who knew bits of the old tongue. A few small curiosities were exchanged. A Karstark soldier showed off a steel sword. A giant responded by displaying a club that dwarfed even the biggest greatsword. The watchers on the walls whispered to each other about the strangeness of it all. Tormund joined Jon near a row of stacked firewood, pressing a flask into his hand. "Drink," he said, cheeks flushed red. "You look paler than a white." Jon took a swig of something harsh and burning, which brought warmth to his limbs. "I'm not used to hosting guests that could step over these walls if they wanted," he admitted. Tormund snorted. "They're not so bad. Big hearts, big fists. They just don't like to be lied to. Told them you'd keep your word, that you'd share your fire in exchange for their might if it comes to battle. Don't give them cause to doubt it." Jon sighed, glancing at one of the larger giants, a creature with a torso like a bear's and a tangled mane that fell past its waist. "Let's hope we don't regret this, but I see little choice. The dead are coming." "Aye, that they are," Tormund said, more serious now. "The big folk don't march south for pleasure. Something beyond the Frostfangs has them spooked. Wights in the passes, rumors of a bigger army of the dead. They heard talk of you, how you were once dead yourself and came back. They respect that kind of madness." Jon almost laughed, though it came out as a grim exhalation. "I'd rather not rely on my own miraculous survival to impress them." "Too late," Tormund grinned. "Now get some rest if you can. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to keep them from knocking down half your castle." The night wore on. Giants bedded down in the courtyard, piling thick hides under themselves and resting heads on their arms. Some dozed upright against Winterfell's walls, letting the wind swirl around them. Mammoths settled like great, hairy boulders, unbothered by the chill. Men in small knots of conversation kept watch by braziers, peering at these guests with mingled awe and trepidation. A new era seemed to dawn in that courtyard, one of improbable alliances and unspoken hopes. By the pale light of morning, the stewards began the laborious process of distributing food. Even meager rations for 100 giants demanded an impressive store. Davos oversaw it grimly, muttering that they would need more supplies from the surrounding holds. The giants, for their part, devoured salted meats, bread, and whatever else was offered without complaint. When asked where they might sleep, most simply grunted and pointed to the open sky. Tormund only laughed, noting they had slept in blizzards before. Winterfell would feel a tropical resort in comparison. Later that day, Jon called a gathering in the Great Hall, though it was far too small to accommodate every giant. Instead, a handful of representatives entered, ducking and twisting to fit within the high arched doors, and took positions near the center of the hall. Furniture had to be hastily pushed aside. Northern lords, including Lady Lyanna Mormont, Lord Glover, Lord Serwyn, and a retinue from House Karstark, stood in anxious clusters. Ser Davos remained at Jon's side, as did Tormund, who served as the unofficial translator for the Old Tongue. The giant chieftain, an imposing female with broad shoulders and long, matted gray hair, introduced herself through a series of guttural phrases. Tormund did his best to parse the meaning. Calls herself Pakulra, means something like rock mother or pillar of stone. She's one of the oldest. Says they've come at great risk, following signs of the White Shadows. Wants to know if we'll stand with them. Jon inclined his head in respect. "We will," he announced, voice echoing in the hall. "We know the dead are rising in the north. If the White Walkers break through, all living creatures, giant, wildling, or kneeler, will fall. We have no choice but to fight side by side." Pakulra's eyes, deep set under a heavy brow, flicked across the assembled mortals. She spoke again, a rumbling challenge in her tone. Tormund listened carefully. "She says they'll fight, but if you betray them, they'll tear down these walls stone by stone. If we keep faith, they'll remember." Jon's face remained solemn. "We won't betray you." He glanced at the northern lords, each wrestling with their own caution, then turned back to Pakulra. "We share a common enemy. When the time comes, we'll fight as one." She exhaled, a sound not quite a sigh, not quite a growl, perhaps acceptance. The tension in the hall ebbed, replaced by a strained sort of relief. Someone brought forth bread and salt once again, which Pakulra accepted, chewing thoughtfully. A hush lingered until Tormund clapped his broad hands together and demanded some ale for all. Jon signaled the servants, who brought out barrels. Giants and men shared a rough meal, stilted conversation, but a small feast nonetheless. Though the fear in the men's eyes never fully vanished, a seed of trust was planted that day. An unspoken pact, They would endure together or die separated. In the weeks that followed, Winterfell bustled with renewed purpose. Once the initial shock of housing giants wore off, the castle began to adapt. The forges were stoked day and night to produce new weapons, both for men and for the giants. Blacksmiths puzzled over how to craft something durable on the scale a giant might wield. Carpenters fashioned oversized crossbows, spears, and clubs. Most of the giants seemed content with their own crude but effective implements, but a few grew curious about steel edges. Meanwhile, supplies dwindled under the strain. Davos dispatched riders to White Harbor, seeking grain, salted fish, and anything else that could feed an army. Lords Glover and Serwyn contributed what they could from their own stores, but winter's grip tightened daily. Snowdrifts piled high against the outer walls, turning every trip beyond the castle into a grueling affair. Hunting parties ventured forth, returning with meager spoils at best, but every bit helped. In the training yards, a strange camaraderie took root. Men sparred with men, wildlings with wildlings, while giants looked on. Some giants tried to mimic swordplay, though they had no need for delicate footwork. Their strength alone was enough to shatter a shield or crush a man. Yet they studied, curious how these smaller folk practiced war. Jon oversaw these sessions with Tormund, explaining the White Walker's vulnerabilities. Dragonglass was distributed where possible, though the supply was pitifully small. Valyrian steel blades were rarer still. The giants themselves had their own knowledge. How to crush wights en masse, how to endure bitter cold. Tormund sometimes teased that they should simply let the giants stomp on the undead until nothing remained. Not all interactions were smooth. A giant might pick up a curious piece of castle masonry to examine it, inadvertently damaging the walls. Or a startled horse might kick a giant's leg, provoking a booming roar that rattled the stables. Rumors spread of a giant who ate an entire side of beef meant to feed 5 families. Fights nearly broke out when a Karstark soldier, half drunk on stolen ale, insulted a giant's parentage. But swift intervention from Tormund and the castle guards prevented bloodshed. Gradually, the novelty settled, replaced by routine. Even so, the pall of impending war hung over them all. Scouts brought fresh reports of the dead sighted near distant villages. Sometimes, survivors arrived at Winterfell's gates, half frozen, babbling about hordes of wights roaming the snowy wastes. Each new tale tightened the knot of dread in Jon's chest. He knew the Night King and his legion would not rest. This was merely a prelude. One afternoon, while Davos and Jon examined a map of the north in the solar, a frantic call rose from the courtyard. Another rider had come bearing urgent news. Jon hurried down the stairs, cloak flapping behind him with Davos at his heel. The rider was a man of House Umber, frost clinging to his beard, his face the color of death. "Whites," he croaked, after a half-collapse into the arms of a guard. "A legion of them, coming for last hearth. We're outnumbered. The Umbers, they need help. Now." He swallowed, eyes glazed with panic. "They might be at our gates in a day or two, maybe less." Jon's heart lurched. House Umber, loyal bannermen to the north, though with a complicated history of late, stood in the far northeast. If their stronghold fell, the dead would have a foothold deeper into the land. Last Hearth was a vital bulwark, and the Umbers had already suffered from earlier skirmishes. They couldn't hold out against a massive wave of wights alone. Jon exchanged a look with Davos, then turned to Tormund and Lyanna Mormont, who were already hurrying over. "We can't let the Umbers stand alone," Jon said, voice firm with resolve. "We march north." Lyanna Mormont's lips tightened, her youthful face hard as iron. "Bear Island will answer," she declared. "We still have knights here, ready to fight. The Umbers may not be our closest allies, but we cannot let the dead claim their seat." Tormund hefted his axe. "The free folk stand with you, Snow. I'll bring the giants. Let's see if the dead fancy a battle against our big friends." Within hours, horns were sounding across Winterfell. An army mustered at breakneck speed. Men from the Karstarks, the Glovers, the Mormonts, wildlings, and, of course, the giants. Tormund led the free folk in forming battalions around their towering allies. Northern knights readied horses, though some balked at marching alongside mammoths. Wagons loaded with provisions rumbled out of the courtyard, carrying as many supplies as they could spare. Jon knew full well that this would be a vicious fight. The Umbers had reported thousands of whites, and possibly white walkers among them. Night fell as they departed, a grim procession winding northward under faint moonlight. The cold had teeth. Fierce winds lashed the riders. Snow came in flurries. Despite the difficult conditions, they pressed on, for every hour counted. Men glanced at the giants stomping alongside them, a bizarre sense of reassurance at these living behemoths in an otherwise bleak land. Tormund's booming orders rang through the night, while Davos rode near Jon, offering sober advice. They pushed hard, but a day and a half's travel still lay between Winterfell and the last hearth, even at speed. Scouts rode ahead to gauge the situation. Camp was made in the lee of a low ridge, but sleep was minimal. Faces drawn, hearts pounding, they woke before dawn to continue the march. Late on the second evening, they neared the last hearth. The fortress stood upon a rise, illuminated by flickering torchlight. But the glow was overshadowed by shadows that churned around the walls. As they drew closer, it became clear the stronghold was under siege. The Umbers, from the high ramparts, loosed arrows and poured flaming oil on the swarms of whites battering the gates. The screams of men and the unearthly shrieks of the dead filled the air, carried by the biting wind. Jon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Umbers were on the brink of being over. Run. He turned to the assembled force, close to 1,000 men, plus 100 giants and their mammoths. "Form up," he shouted. "Archers behind, giants in front. We hit them hard and drive them away from the walls." Tormund's voice echoed. "You heard him. Move, you idiots." The giants roared in acknowledgement, brandishing clubs, axes, or simply their enormous fists. Men rushed to form ranks, weapons at the ready. Davos signaled a few archers to take position on a nearby rise. Lord Glover and his horsemen positioned themselves for a flanking maneuver. Lyanna Mormont spurred her mount, leading her Bear Island knights to the right flank. The whine of wind only heightened the tension. Jon raised his sword, Longclaw, Valyrian steel, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. "Charge!" he cried. A horn blast followed, deep and resonant. Then the allied army surged forward into the chaos. They hit the whites like a hammer on an anvil. Giants at the forefront slammed through the ranks of the dead, each swing of a club sending broken corpses flying. Men in the giants' wake slashed at the scattered whites, hacking off limbs and heads. Arrows rained from above, normal shafts and those lit with flame, peppering the undead crowd. Mammoths barreled in, crushing the dead beneath their massive feet, though some whites leaped onto the beasts, clawing and biting. Despite their ferocity, the whites were legion, clambering over their own fallen to reach the living. Jon saw men dragged down beneath a wave of clawing hands, their screams abruptly cut off. A giant roared in agony as a cluster of whites scaled its back, stabbing it with rusted blades. The creature toppled, crushing a score of the dead but eventually lying still. The clash of steel, the shrieking wind, and the howls of combat mingled in a hellish din. Jon forced his way forward, Ghost beside him tearing at undead throats. He swung Longclaw at every decayed face that lunged, severing bodies that continued to twitch. The stench of corruption enveloped everything. In the flickering light, he glimpsed Tormund's red hair bobbing amidst the carnage, the wildling hacking with an axe, face set in savage determination. Giants bellowed, flinging whites aside in clumps, clearing momentary pockets of safety. They pressed on, step by bloody step, toward the battered gates of the last hearth. Through the swirling melee, Jon spotted Umber soldiers on the walls, valiantly trying to hold back the tide. Even from a distance, it was clear they were on their last legs. The gates were splintered, whites forcing their way into the courtyard. "Push through," Jon roared, urging men and giants alike to keep advancing. Another wave of flaming arrows soared overhead, crashing into the undead horde with bursts of fire. The smell of burning flesh was pungent and nauseating, but the whites kept coming. A giant in front of Jon seized a wagon set aflame and swung it like a makeshift flail, scattering whites in a blazing arc. Embers flew, illuminating the field of battle. That brief respite allowed Jon and a cluster of Karstark soldiers to break through to the ruined gate. The courtyard beyond was a scene from a nightmare. Corpses strewn everywhere, many reanimated and still fighting. The Umbers, outnumbered, retreated into the keep, barricading doors. Jon rallied those around him. "Secure the gate. We have to clear them out of here." The giant flung the flaming wagon into a knot of whites near the main gatehouse. A thunderous crash echoed, followed by shrieks as the undead burned. Tormund's group funneled in behind, driving the whites toward the courtyard center. The Bear Island Knights galloped in from the side, spearing the scattered dead. Giants formed a new line, clubs battering anything that moved. Slowly, painfully, the living began to push back the whites. The courtyard, once filled with a swarm of the dead, became a churning mess of body parts and sundered limbs. More than once, a giant unleashed a devastating blow that pulped half a dozen undead at once. Jon carved through white after white, Longclaw's Valyrian edge unstoppable. The ground turned slick with blackened fluids and torn flesh. Yet, for every white they felled, more pressed in from the outer yard. Then Jon sensed it, a cold presence, like shards of ice prickling his spine. His breath caught. Emerging from the swirling snow, a tall figure in armor of frosted crystal strode forward. A white walker. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly blue. Behind it, more whites came to reinforce the assault. Another walker emerged at its side, brandishing a spear of ice. "Keep fighting!" Jon cried, though fear coursed through him. The walker's gaze fixed on him, as if recognizing an old adversary. Jon advanced, heart hammering. He knew his Valyrian steel could kill them, but they were as fast as they were deadly. The first walker lunged, moving with inhuman swiftness. Its icy blade crashed against Longclaw. Sparks flew, and the air itself seemed to crackle with unnatural cold. Jon gritted his teeth, straining to hold his ground. The walker's strength was formidable, each blow nearly buckling Jon's arms. The second walker circled, seeking an opening. Around them, men and giants clashed with the undead tide. He heard Tormund's war cry in the distance, saw a giant drop to one knee under a throng of shrieking whites, only to rise again, flinging them aside. Lynna Mormont skewered a white from horseback, face grim with determination. Every breath was pain. The wind howled, swirling snow into a frenzy, as if the storm itself were hungry for blood. Jon feinted left, then slashed the walker's side. The creature hissed, shards of ice fracturing. In a swift counter, it raked its blade across Jon's bracer. The leather froze and cracked, but Jon twisted away, narrowly avoiding losing his arm. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the second walker raising its spear, ready to impale him. A guttural roar tore through the night. A giant barreled forward, intercepting the second walker's thrust with a massive club. The impact sent the walker flying, though it twisted in midair, landing with eerie grace. The giant then swung at the first walker, forcing it back from Jon. Panting, Jon nodded his thanks to the behemoth, who roared and charged again. That gave Jon just enough time to refocus. He darted forward, Longclaw flashing. The second walker parried, but the force of the giant's blow had cracked its arm. Sensing weakness, Jon pressed the advantage, slicing down through the walker's weapon. With a sound like ice under sudden heat, the blade shattered. Jon drove Longclaw into the walker's chest. The creature shrieked and exploded into shards, dissolving into the night. Meanwhile, the first walker had slashed the giant's leg. Pale blood poured from the wound, and the giant bellowed in agony, staggering. Jon leaped to its defense, crossing blades with the walker. Steel rang on ice. Each strike jolted Jon's arms to the bone. A twist, a parry. He found an opening and jammed Longclaw through the walker's side. Icy shards burst outward, the walker's form collapsing with a haunting wail. The giant slumped to one side, wounded but alive. With both white walkers destroyed, the whites lost coherence. Some staggered aimlessly. Others crumpled where they stood. The living seized the moment, hacking down the remaining undead or driving them from the courtyard. A ragged cheer went up from those still breathing. Bodies littered the ground, human, giant, and white alike. But the last hearth was not yet lost. Jon bent over, hands on his knees, lungs burning. Blood dripped from a cut above his brow. Around him, men coughed in the freezing air, many slumping to the ground from exhaustion or wounds. Giants sat heavily on rubble, cradling injuries. The Umbers peered out from their keep's battered entrance, stunned by the sight of a force that included towering giants among the rescuers. Tormund stumbled up, face streaked with soot. He surveyed the carnage, exhaling. "We did it," he managed. "We saved them." Jon nodded, wiping sweat from his eyes. "This time," he said grimly, "they'll come again in greater numbers." "Let them," Tormund spat. "We'll be ready. With these big folk on our side, I like our chances better than I ever have." Jon straightened, wincing at the ache in his muscles. "We'll need to gather our strength. Many are wounded. We need to salvage what we can." He cast a glance at the giant who had helped him slay the walker, now nursing a gash in its thigh. "We have to see to our injured as well, men and giants." Davos appeared, somehow still upright, though his face was ghastly pale. "We'll need a proper count of our dead. And it looks like the Umbers have taken heavy losses, too." Jon dipped his head, feeling the weight of command. "See to it. Let's fortify this place as best we can before nightfall. The whites might rally if there are more walkers out there. We can't afford to be caught unprepared." So they set about the grim work, gathering corpses of the dead, human or undead, and burning them in great pyres, erecting makeshift barricades, patching the shattered gates with timbers. Giants and men worked side by side, an uneasy alliance turned battle-forged bond. Umber survivors emerged from their keep, thanking the newcomers with stunned sincerity. Somewhere amid the gloom, Lady Lyanna Mormont barked orders at her knights, urging them to help the wounded. Tormund collapsed against a pile of rubble, catching his breath while wildlings patted him on the back, praising their victory. The wind carried the acrid smell of smoke and charred flesh into the winter sky. At dawn, with the fires smoldering and a lull in the undead threat, Jon stood on the battered battlements of the last hearth, gazing out at the vast expanse of snow-covered wilderness. His cloak flapped in the cutting wind. He could see giants moving below, limping among the fallen, comforting each other in their booming voices. Men likewise tended to one another, preparing to move those too wounded to stay. The day would be spent consolidating what ground they had. But the war was far from done. He remembered the face of the White Walker that had locked blades with him, the cold hatred in its eyes. The Night King's hordes were legion, unstoppable by conventional means. This was just a fraction of their might. Yet they had repulsed them here in part because of the raw strength of the giants and the unity of the North. For the first time in a long while, Jon felt a stirring of hope. If men and giants could stand as brothers, perhaps there was a fighting chance. Footsteps behind him drew his attention. Tormund approached, battered but unbowed. "We'll head back to Winterfell once we're sure the Umbers can hold," he said. "Can't defend every holdfast, but we gave the Night King a black eye here, at least." Jon nodded, watching wisps of breath float from his lips. "We did, and the giants proved their worth." Tormund bared a grin through his thick beard. "Aye, that they did. You see the one that saved your hide with that walker?" Jon let out a soft snort. "I saw. I'll thank him personally." They stood in silence for a moment, the chill wind slicing between them. Far below, fires still crackled. Wounded men groaned, and giants rumbled in quiet lament for their fallen kin. A hush settled over the ruined courtyard, as if the land itself paused to reckon with what had transpired. After a spell, Jon spoke in a subdued tone. "We need to convince more houses to rally. Maybe word of how giants fought to save the North will sway them. If we can't bring everyone together, no fortress, no matter how stout, will stand in the face of the dead. Not even Winterfell. Tormund gave a slow nod. We'll ride to them, then. Spread the word. And if they refuse to listen, he spat. Then they're fools, good as dead. Jon's hand tightened on the stone parapet. Let's hope they see sense. He glanced east, where the faint glow of the rising sun painted the horizon in pale colors. Because winter isn't letting up, and neither are the White Walkers. They shared a sober look, then descended the stairs to join the aftermath below. Each step measured, each breath a reminder of how fragile life could be. Giants and men had spilled blood together this night. The hush of morning offered no illusion that the trials were over. Far from it. But a bond had been forged in the flames of battle, a defiance that might just hold the North or break in the attempt. In the days that followed, the battered force lingered at the last hearth long enough to shore up the defenses and tend to the wounded. Even the giants lent their strength, hauling timbers into place to repair the gates, although their massive footprints tore up the courtyard further. The Umbers, shaken but grateful, allowed the strange alliance to roam freely through their corridors, as long as the giants stooped to avoid destroying doorways. It was an image none living would soon forget. Great behemoths stepping gingerly through a once proud hall, men scurrying aside to make room. Slowly, the injured were stabilized, though many had wounds that would fester in the freezing conditions. The dead were burned outside the fortress walls in roaring pyres that lit the winter nights. Smoke hung in the air, a funeral shroud. Mourning took many forms. Stoic silence from northern knights, howling lament from wildlings, low, sonorous keening from the giants. Some men said the ground shook with the giants' grief. When Tormund judged the host ready, they departed in segments, returning south along the same treacherous route. The giants formed a protective rearguard, watching the flanks with their keen eyes. Men huddled around wagons, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for fresh horrors. Snow fell relentlessly, as if the sky itself conspired to bury all in white oblivion. Yet the alliance trudged on, compelled by the knowledge that Winterfell remained the central bastion against the invasion of the dead. Jon rode near the front, Ghost loping alongside with ears perked. Ser Davos guided the column with a map, though the roads had all but vanished beneath drifts. Lyanna Mormont's knights, battered but unbroken, maintained a vigilant watch. Day bled into night, night into day, the cold unwavering. Sometimes they glimpsed distant shapes moving across ridgelines, uncertain if they were living or dead, friend or foe. But the shapes vanished, leaving only uneasy minds behind. When at last Winterfell's towers came into sight, relief washed over them, tempered by sorrow for those who had been lost. The gates groaned open to admit the returning columns. The courtyard, once again, shook under the footsteps of giants. Shouts of greeting mingled with cries of alarm from newcomers who had arrived in Jon's absence. Some small retinues from lesser houses, perhaps. It was a chaotic homecoming, but at least it was home. Jon swung down from his horse, staggering a bit from exhaustion. Tormund slapped him on the back, nearly knocking him off his feet. "We're back. Let's hope you've got something stronger than watered ale in those cellars." Jon mustered a weary grin. "You'll find it. Have some mercy on the men, though. They're half frozen." "We're all half frozen," Tormund declared, then waved an arm at the giants filing in. "And them? They might even want more than a drink after that scrap." Jon nodded. He could see the fatigue in everyone's faces, giant and man alike. "We'll get them settled, check the injured, then we plan the next step." As word spread of their stand at the last hearth and how giants had risked their lives to save northern men, a subtle shift took place in Winterfell's atmosphere. Fear gave way, at least in part, to respect. Soldiers who once shied from giant kind began to approach them more openly, offering thanks or sharing a loaf of bread. The bond, fragile though it was, had been tempered by fire and blood. Yet with that small triumph came the unyielding realization that time was running out. The White Walkers would not be deterred forever. Reports trickled in of undead sightings further west, near the mountain passes. The dead were spreading like a plague, encroaching on every vulnerable holdfast. Ravens arrived from distant lords, some pledging men, others admitting they lacked the strength to join the fight. Tension simmered in every corner of Winterfell as the snows piled higher and higher. One bitterly cold evening, Jon met with Davos, Tormund, and Lyanna Mormont in Winterfell's map room, a modest chamber with a long wooden table upon which maps of the north were unrolled. A handful of other northern lords clustered around, listening intently. A crackling fire burned in the hearth, but offered little comfort against the chill. Lyanna spoke first, her fierce gaze flitting across the parchment. "We've had word from White Harbor. They're mustering a fleet to bring supplies upriver, but ice is blocking much of the route. House Serwyn is sending what men they can spare, and House Reed from the Neck might send a small force. But we'll be outnumbered if the Night King arrives with the brunt of his army." Jon raked a hand through his hair, which had grown longer in the weeks of constant campaigning. "We can't fight them in open ground, even with the giants. We need to choose where we make our stand." Davos, arms folded, leaned over the map. "We could try to lure them to Moat Cailin, use the natural choke point. But the White Walkers can cross frozen swampland if it comes to that. And the fortress there is half ruined. Winterfell is stronger, but if we're surrounded," Tormund grunted. "We hole up in Winterfell, we risk letting half the north be swallowed by the dead. And no castle is impenetrable. Look at the last hearth. If we hadn't come, it would have fallen in a night." Lyanna's jaw tightened. "My people won't want to abandon their homes. But if the White Walkers sweep across the land, no home will be safe anyway." She paused, glancing at Jon. "You're the one who came back from the dead. What do you think?" Jon's eyes flickered to the flickering firelight. Memories of hard home, of whites pouring over the cliffs, burned in his mind. "We need one decisive battle," he said quietly. "A place where we stand together. Every man, every giant, every ally we can muster. Winterfell is our seat of power. It has the best walls, the best chance. We can store supplies here, gather reinforcements. We can attempt to fortify the grounds around it, create kill zones. If we lure the Night King here, perhaps we stand a chance." A brooding silence fell on the room. They all knew how risky such a plan was. If Winterfell fell, the heart of the North would be lost. But no better alternative presented itself. Gradually, nods spread around the table. Tormund clapped a hand on the hilt of his axe. "Then we fight here. Let the dead come. We'll greet them with steel and giant fury." Davos lifted his brow. "We'll need every advantage. Dragonglass if we can get any more. Fire traps, archers on the walls. We can post giants at weak points, have them hurl boulders at the horde. But all of this means nothing if the Night King brings his creatures. Dragons." His voice caught, remembering the stories of the Night King's resurrected dragon, which Daenerys Targaryen had lost. "We don't have a way to stop that, do we?" An uneasy murmur passed through the room. Jon glanced down, troubled by the memory of a fallen dragon's blue-flamed wrath. "There may be dragons on our side too," he said softly. "Daenerys, if she can be reached, if her forces can push north. But I don't know if there's time." Lyanna Mormont's face hardened. "Then we make ready with what we have. We can't rely on help from far away. The north stands or falls on its own." "So be it," Jon said finally. "We begin preparing Winterfell for the final stand. We spread word to every house. If they can come, come. We gather food, weapons. We train peasants if need be. The giants will help bolster our defenses." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. "This is our best chance. Let's not waste it." With that, the war council ended. Each lord, each leader, went forth with new tasks. Winterfell soon transformed into a hive of activity. The ring of blacksmiths' hammers never ceased. Carpenters built massive barriers, spikes to line the fields. Masons shored up the curtain walls. Tormund and the wildlings led the giants through strategy drills of sorts, though strategy for giants more often meant smashing things until nothing moved. Still, they practiced maneuvers, placing them at intervals around the fortress so no section could be overwhelmed. Men grew more accustomed to living under their formidable shadows. Elsewhere, ravens sped across the sky, summoning any who would answer. Some brought replies of support, others grim silence. As the days drew on, a procession of small groups arrived, battered by the elements. A few dozens from House Reed, a scattering of mountain clan warriors, a tardy retinue of Manderleys from White Harbor. Some pitched tents in the outer bailey, others huddled in corners of the castle. Always, the question hung in the air. Would it be enough? In the darkest hours before dawn, Jon would sometimes walk the walls alone. The cold bit deeper every night. His mind churned with worry over the unstoppable onslaught waiting beyond the horizon. But when he gazed down at the courtyard, where giants rested in hulking silhouettes against the moonlight, an ember of hope burned in him. They had defied the odds more than once. Perhaps they could do so again. Perhaps the living, united in a way unseen for centuries, could hold back the long night. The time would come soon enough. The sound of distant horns and frantic scouts would one day tear through the hush, announcing the arrival of the Night King's Legion. The living would rally to their positions, hearts in their throats, swords in shaking hands, giants gripping clubs that could topple gates. And in the final reckoning, whether it ended in a blaze of triumphant dawn or the utter silence of eternal night, they would all stand together on the ramparts of Winterfell, men and giants side by side, forging a defiance no one had ever thought possible. For now, though, as the snow drifted endlessly and the winds carried the howls of distant wolves, Jon Snow paused in the courtyard, resting a hand against the flank of a slumbering mammoth. Its coarse fur was warm beneath his glove, and the massive creature snorted softly in its sleep. A few paces away, a wounded giant dozed, bandaged legs stretched out. They were such improbable allies. Yet here they were, in the heart of the north, bound by necessity and a flicker of faith. Jon gazed at them in the dim torchlight, the hush of the winter night pressing in, and allowed himself one rare moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, and the steady march toward the looming great battle. But in that fleeting moment, Jon Snow drew quiet strength from the presence of these colossal warriors who had placed their trust in him. Together, they would greet the oncoming storm. And perhaps, just perhaps, the north would endure. Jon stood quietly in the courtyard, leaning his weight against the sleeping mammoth's flank, the rough woolly coat radiating a heat that almost felt alive with its own heartbeat. He had never imagined this would be his life, surrounded by creatures out of the oldest legends, forging alliances that defied the ancient divisions between men and wildlings, and fighting side by side with giants against death itself. The hush of the late winter night settled over Winterfell with a fragile calm. Snow drifted in lazy spirals around the towers, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, the sound echoing off the old stone walls. He allowed himself just one moment of stillness, a single breath of respite. Then, steeling his resolve, he straightened, giving the mammoth a gentle pat. The beast snorted softly but did not stir. He slipped through the swirling snow toward the steps that led into the castle proper, mind already turning to the tasks that lay ahead. With each day, the war drew closer, and time seemed thinner than a sheet of ice over a rushing river. Inside, the corridors flickered with the glow of torches. Servants and guards bustled about, some casting apprehensive glances at the tall silhouettes of giants who occasionally lumbered through doorways that had to be modified, or who peered curiously at the tapestries and halls of a fortress so alien to them. Since the forces returned from the last hearth, the wounded had been lodged wherever space could be found. Cots lined the great hall, the library antechambers, and the lesser-used portions of the keep. The groans of men in pain mixed with the low rumble of giants tending each other, conversing in deep murmurs that reverberated through the castle's corridors. Jon made his way to the makeshift infirmary set up in what had once been a storage chamber near the castle's eastern wing. There, by the light of lanterns, Maester Wolkan worked with bandaged arms. Several wildling healers assisted him, along with Gilly, who had proven adept at nursing wounds on the journey south from the wall. Other local healers moved quietly between the cots, changing dressings, administering broth, or pressing bandages to festering gashes left by white claws. "John," said Wolken with a weary nod. "Late as it is, you're still up? I'm told you hardly rest." "I'll manage." John gazed across the rows of wounded. Men who had fought bravely at the last hearth, now pale with fever or asleep from pain. Among them, he spotted a giant lying on its side, occupying half the room. The wound in its thigh was wrapped in thick linen, still seeping. The giant's eyes were closed, its breathing labored. "How is everyone?" The maester rubbed exhaustion from his face. "We're fighting infection and frostbite, the usual afflictions made worse by the cold. Some may lose fingers, toes. Others have deeper wounds that might never heal properly." His voice dropped, glancing at the big shape of the resting giant. "As for that one, we stitched the laceration, but it festers. Giants can withstand a great deal, yet it was a foul wound. Time will tell." John exhaled, feeling the weight of each casualty like a stone in his gut. "We'll need them all when the time comes," he said softly, though he knew how callous that might sound. These were people, living souls, not just weapons for war. Even so, survival depended on every able body. Wolken managed a tight smile. "I will do everything in my power. But if the weather keeps on like this, we'll be short on certain supplies. Poultices, herbs. We had a decent store, but the demand grows. We'll scavenge what we can," John promised. "There are villages in the region. Herbalists might still have some stock. I'll speak to Davos about sending riders with coin or with strong arms to trade. There must be something left." Wolken looked uncertain, but he nodded. "We'll use whatever arrives. We can't afford to lose more men to infection." John lingered a moment, checking on a few of the worst cases. Some recognized him, mustering faint salutes or half-hearted smiles. A Karstark soldier with a missing hand blinked with feverish eyes, whispering something about home. A wildling woman, her face bruised purple, managed a stiff nod of acknowledgement. The giant, hearing the soft murmurs, cracked open one eye. The creature offered a weak grunt, as if greeting John. He placed a hand on the massive shoulder in a gesture of comfort, though it felt wholly inadequate. The giant's rumbling breath stirred his hair. Despite everything, it tried to speak in the old tongue, but John understood only the sense of gratitude, the searching for reassurance. He answered as best he could, dipping his head, quietly willing the giant to recover. Leaving the infirmary, he traversed the main hallway. Outside, the wind moaned through the gatehouse. Within, a few watchers kept vigil, huddled in thick cloaks. Most of Winterfell's inhabitants, men, giants, wildlings, and others, were trying to snatch what sleep they could. Yet John knew that somewhere in the castle, a war council was likely being held. He had told everyone to rest, but doubts gnawed at him. He was no king, only a man struggling to keep the North alive. It felt like all the old feuds and politics had taken a back seat to raw survival. For that alone, he was grateful, but the burden pressed down day and night. He turned a corner and nearly bumped into Lina Mormont. The small lady of Bear Island wore her customary scowl, dressed in a thick coat of bear fur. She glanced up at him with sharp eyes. "Jon Snow," she said, the steel in her voice somewhat tempered by fatigue. "You look like a ghost roaming these halls." He forced a faint smile. "Could say the same of you. Couldn't sleep." She shook her head. "I tried. My mind won't stop. Every time I close my eyes, I see the dead that nearly took the last hearth. We only survived because we fought together. Still, I can't help wondering if next time, we won't have enough to hold them back." Her small hands clenched at her sides. "How do you bear it, knowing what's coming?" John's gaze flickered to the old stones around them. He remembered the stories of the long night, the ancient wars, and the thousands who perished. "I've borne it for a while, ever since Hardhome. It's not easy, but I hold on to the idea that we're doing what must be done. That's all we have. We can't turn away from the truth." She pursed her lips, then nodded, and for a moment, A spark of raw admiration lit her features. Bear Island stands with the North. We stand with you. I want you to know that. Pause, and then she lowered her voice. I heard from the men that a handful of new arrivals from House Manderley came earlier. I plan to see them at first light to make sure they're fully committed. The Manderleys can be slippery as eels when it comes to politics. Jon rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. We'll take all the help we can get. Thank you, Lady Mormont. Try to find some rest afterward. We'll have many decisions to make soon. She nodded once more, pivoted smartly, and strode off toward the wing where her knights were quartered. Jon watched her go, the flicker of torchlight playing on her determined face, then continued toward the solar where Davos often worked late into the night. He found the door half open, lamplight glowing within. Davos was hunched over a table littered with quills, half-finished letters, and a battered map. Davos glanced up, rubbing his eyes. You're out late as well. Not surprising. Jon stepped in, shutting the door against the corridor's chill. Did you discover anything useful? A raven from White Harbor arrived, Davos said, rifling through the parchment. They're still trying to break through the ice-choked sections of the White Knife. They might send more provisions once the waterways clear, but the freeze is thickening. We can't rely on that. As for House Serwyn, they've promised another 50 men. Better than nothing. The Crannogmen might come from the neck, though you never know with them. And, he sighed, some houses haven't bothered replying at all. Jon nodded grimly, moving to peer at the map. He saw the lines indicating the roads, mostly rendered impassable by snow. We can send riders to the ones who haven't answered. We need to impress the urgency on them. Davos ran a hand over his stubble. We'll try, but the roads are perilous. If a blizzard hits, our messengers could vanish in the drifts. And every man or horse we lose outside Winterfell is one fewer for the fight. Jon stared at the swirling ink lines that represented the North. So vast, so cold. We have to risk it. A few more days might be all we have before the Night King's next move. The Umber situation proved they could strike quickly, anywhere. Davos gave a curt nod, then leaned back. You look exhausted, Jon. You'd best catch some rest. Jon managed a faint shrug. I will, soon. But first I want to check on Tormund. Davos nodded with understanding. He's at the stables, last I heard, seeing to the mammoths. He claims they fight better if he talks to them. I'll keep writing these letters, though the ink's freezing on my quill at times. He glanced at the guttering lamp. I might need another candle soon. Jon patted him gently on the shoulder. Don't stay up too long, my friend. I need you sharp tomorrow. Davos offered a wry grin. I'll do my best. He returned to his work, the quill scratching softly. Jon left, heading toward the stable yard. Outside, the cold slapped him in the face again, though he had grown almost numb to it. The yard was quieter than usual, with only a couple of watchfires flickering. The mammoths, too large to fit in the stables, were settled along the castle's outer wall, where an enclosure of sorts had been improvised. Barrels of feed were stacked high. Giants ambled here and there, their heavy limbs rustling through straw. Some men of the free folk gathered around a fire, passing a jug of something strong that made them laugh in hushed, weary tones. Above, the sky stretched, silent and endless, stars veiled by drifting clouds. He found Tormund near a mammoth that had lost part of one tusk in the last hearth battle. The wildling was stroking the creature's trunk, murmuring in the guttural speech that many of the free folk used with their beasts. When he saw Jon approach, Tormund's face split into a broad grin, though a thread of fatigue dulled his usual exuberance. Snow, he greeted. You're stalking about like a restless ghost. So I'm told, Jon said. How are things here? Tormund jerked his thumb at the large shape of the mammoth. Not too bad. Big fella's healing up. Just a chipped tusk, but it pains him. We're feeding them what we can. Mostly hay, some dried grasses we brought down from the tundra. The giants know how to care for them better than we do, but it's not easy in these cramped walls. Jon looked around, marveling anew at the surreal sight of mammoths within Winterfell's enclosure. "We'll have to manage. How are the giants? Any more trouble with men who don't trust them?" Tormund snorted. "A few scuffles, but nothing major. Most of your kneelers have seen what they can do against the whites and aren't eager to pick fights. Some still jump out of their skins when a giant stomps by, but fear's a good teacher. Better than a thrashing." Jon's gaze wandered to a corner where a giant was reclining on a mound of straw, gazing up at the night sky as though counting the flickers of the moon through clouds. "Good. We need them calm so everyone can focus on the real threat." Tormund shifted, folding his arms across his broad chest. "And what about you? That face of yours could sour goat's milk. Did you get any decent news?" "Some. House Serwyn sends more men, but the rest of our messages are half-answered, if at all." Winter's thickening. Jon watched his breath plume in the faint glow of the watchfire. "Soon, we'll have to make do with whoever's inside these walls." Tormund nodded, gaze trailing across the yard. "We were always going to be outnumbered. That's not new. Giants help even the odds, but this battle is bigger than numbers, anyway. It's about heart, will. If we stand together, that's all we can do." Jon appreciated the blunt wisdom in Tormund's words. "You're right," he said quietly, "and I'm grateful for your help." "Bah!" Tormund waved a hand. "You're the one who got us together, but don't think I won't remind you of it if we survive. I'll want a nice feast someday, with roast pig and ale for a week." A wry smile tugged at Jon's lips. "If we live, I'll grant you all the ale Winterfell can muster." "That's a promise," Tormund said. His expression turned reflective. "I miss the wide open sometimes, the freezing mountains, the wind in my beard. This castle is a cage, no matter how big it is. But I see its purpose. We need walls to keep the whites at bay, and the men at your back need a fortress to steel their courage. So we'll stay. For now." Jon knew Tormund's restlessness well. The free folk were not used to these stone confines, the giants even less so, yet they all gathered here in a desperate stand. "Thank you," was all Jon could say. They exchanged a final nod. Then Jon left him to coax the mammoth into resting. By the time Jon returned to his own chambers, the first streaks of dawn threatened the sky, though the sun itself would remain hidden behind thick clouds. He collapsed into a cot, letting himself drift into a fitful sleep for a precious few hours. When he awoke, the entire castle was in motion. He splashed his face with icy water, grimacing at the jolt to his senses, then hurried downstairs. Servants hustled through the halls, distributing meager breakfasts. Stale bread, porridge thinned with water, the last of the eggs from the coops. Resources ran tighter every day. In the courtyard, men and women drilled with spears, swords, and bows, their breath misting around them in ragged bursts. Giants watched from the sidelines, sometimes grunting at each other in commentary. He found Davos by the main gate, overseeing a small group of riders who were preparing to depart. The old knight was giving final instructions to a young man in a heavy cloak. "Try High Point and the villages along the northern roads," Davos was saying. "But if a storm blows in, you find shelter and wait it out." "Understood." The rider nodded, set his jaw, and kicked his horse forward. A half-dozen more followed, hooves crunching in the snow. The gates groaned open, letting them vanish into a swirl of white. Davos turned to Jon with a tired sigh. "There goes another batch of envoys. Might be our last. We can't spare too many more horses." Jon looked after the riders until they faded into the wintry distance. "Any word from Targaryen forces? I know we sent a raven to Dragonstone, to wherever Daenerys might be." Davos pursed his lips. "No fresh word yet. Some say she's still entangled in the south, or regrouping after her losses. Others say her dragons were last seen flying across the narrow sea in search of new allies. Truth is, we don't know. She might not arrive in time, if she arrives at all." Jon absorbed this with a grim nod. He had hoped to see the flicker of dragon wings across the horizon, some sign that Daenerys Targaryen still fought for the living. But the distance was vast, and winter storms made flight treacherous, even for dragons. They could ill afford to wait for a miracle. Then we plan as if she isn't coming. Davos agreed softly. We rely on what's at hand, and we pray the gods have some mercy. They parted ways, and Jon spent the rest of that day directing fortifications. The entire perimeter of Winterfell had to be reinforced. Wooden stakes angled outward, new trenches dug where the ground wasn't entirely frozen solid, stockpiles of pitch for flaming arrows and scorpion bolts. The giants assisted with hauling timbers and stone, often accomplishing in an hour what would have taken men a day. Pakolra, the gray-haired chieftain, strode through the yard like a queen among her folk, giving orders in the old tongue to the younger giants, who complied with lumbering cooperation. From time to time, Jon tried to speak with her, bridging the language gap with Tormund's translation. And as Pakolra demanded to know how soon the white shadows would appear, to which Jon could only answer with uncertainty. She snorted, unimpressed, but kept her people working. It was a precarious truce. The giants had come to fight their ancient enemy, but they had no fondness for castles or men's tactics. Only their fear and anger at the undead kept them grounded in Winterfell's cause. During a midday drill, Jon noticed that Lyanna Mormont and her knights were training a handful of volunteer peasants, lads and lasses who had fled outlying villages. The Bear Island lady was relentless, barking commands as she taught them the basics of spear thrusts and shield walls. The recruits were raw, but some showed spirit. If nothing else, they would hold a spear line behind more seasoned fighters, adding numbers to the inevitable confrontation. Near sunset, the gates opened to admit a small party of newcomers led by Lord Glover, who had traveled north after sending word. Their arrival caused a stir. About 30 more men, half-starved, accompanied by a pair of horse-drawn carts carrying salted fish. Glover himself looked haggard, as though the march through snow had taken everything out of him. Yet he marched into the courtyard, scanning the presence of giants with a flicker of unease in his eyes. Jon went to meet him. "Lord Glover, thank you for coming." The man doffed his glove, rubbing his raw hands together. "I wish the circumstances were better, Lord Snow. I lost half my men at Deepwood Motte to a band of whites prowling near the coast. We managed to fight them off, but it was costly. I bring only what I can spare." Jon nodded soberly. "Every man is needed. Join us inside, we'll find room. We're reinforcing the walls as best we can. The giants are with us, and we'll soon place them around Winterfell's perimeter. But we'll need you and your people as well." Glover's mouth tightened at the mention of giants, but he only said, "I've heard stories of them since I was a boy. Never thought I'd see them in my lifetime, let alone fight beside them." He gestured to the swaying forms that towered over the courtyard. "I'll keep my men in line, so long as your allies don't trample us by accident." Jon managed a thin smile. "We'll do what we can. We have stewards to help you settle in." He motioned, and a pair of guards guided the new arrivals toward the great yard. With each new day, the tension in the air grew. The nights felt longer, colder, as if the darkness itself was deepening in anticipation. Jon found himself scanning the horizon from Winterfell's highest tower each dawn and dusk, searching for any sign of a massive undead host. The watchers he posted on the walls reported only endless white fields, barren of movement. Yet that brought little comfort. The White Walkers could descend without warning, traveling under storms and obscured by swirling snow. Scouts ventured in smaller circles around Winterfell, but the further they went, the greater the peril. A few did not return. Those who did spoke of glimpsing suspicious shapes or stumbling upon the remains of destroyed farmsteads, where the people had fled or been taken. Occasionally, they found fresh corpses, left behind in the snow. It was impossible to know whether the bodies might soon rise again. Jon ordered them burned whenever possible. But the north was vast, and there were not enough living souls to do more than scratch the surface. On one such bleak morning, the horns sounded thrice from the watchtower. Jon jolted awake from a short sleep, heart hammering. 3 blasts, enemies approaching or something akin. He hastened to don his thick cloak, belting Longclaw at his side, and rushed to the ramparts. Soldiers were already mustering, running along the walls. Giants, roused by alarm, stood in the courtyard, gripping clubs or stone axes. The sky was leaden, the swirl of snow thick enough to obscure the horizon. Jon joined the watchers at the northern battlements, peering out. He saw movement across the plain, but the snowfall prevented any clear view. The watchers pointed, whispering about dark shapes half glimpsed through the storm. Tormund arrived at Jon's side, face grim. "Are they here?" Before Jon could answer, another horn blast echoed, reverberating in the winter air. A tense hush fell. Archers lined up, knocking arrows, though most were normal steel. Dragonglass was in short supply. Men on the catapults and scorpions prepared for orders. Giants rumbled, preparing to move if commanded. But as the shapes drew closer, the watchers realized they were not wights. A shout went up, "They're men! Horsemen!" The gate captain looked to Jon for direction. Jon raised his voice. "Hold your fire. Open the gates, but keep a watchful eye." The gates creaked wide, and from the swirling white drift rode a small group of humans, cloaked in furs. Their horses stumbled through the ruts, frosted with ice. As they neared, one of the riders collapsed sideways, toppling into the snow with a low groan. Soldiers rushed out to help. Another rider lifted a hand in a feeble greeting. They were 5 in total, each looking half dead from exposure, though they wore the sigils of various smaller houses and travelers. One was a woman with a ragged bandage over her forehead. Jon descended from the wall in haste, heart pounding. He approached as the men carefully brought the riders in, supporting them. The courtyard bristled with tension. Giants and men ringed them, weapons in hand, uncertain if this was friend or foe. Tormund sidled near, axe in hand, though he kept it lowered. The wounded woman managed to raise her face, eyes dull with exhaustion. "We come from the west," she gasped. "We saw them. Gods help us, we saw them." Jon's stomach nodded. "Slowly now. You're safe here. Who are you, and what happened?" One of the riders, a sallow-cheeked man with a torn cloak, coughed violently. "We were part of a larger band, trying to reach Winterfell from Torrens Square. Wights. They came upon us near the shivering forest. We tried to outrun them. Some turned back. We pressed on, losing half our party." His breath rattled. "They're on the move, my lord. A great swarm of them. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Hard to count. Headed this way." A chill deeper than any winter wind coiled in Jon's gut. "How far behind you?" The man shook his head, clearly unsure. "Could be 2 days, could be 3. The storms slow them down, but they come all the same. We heard them in the night, the shrieking. Saw them in the moonlight. It stretches wide across the plains." Jon pressed his lips together. "Get these people to the infirmary," he told the nearest steward. "Warm them, feed them. Then we'll learn more." As the riders were helped away, the courtyard erupted in hushed curses, uneasy exchanges of looks. The men on the ramparts, though expecting news of the dead, still shuddered at hearing how close the legion might be. Giants muttered in their deep voices, shifting from foot to foot. Tormund caught Jon's eye, the lines of his brow carved with concern. "We have at most 3 days, probably less," Jon said to him quietly. "We'll assume the worst, that the dead will reach us soon. Spread word. We ready for battle now?" Tormund nodded. "Aye, I'll gather the free folk, the big folk too. We'll man the outer walls, set watchers around the clock." Jon directed a few subcommanders to do the same for the northern forces. Every able-bodied fighter was called to arms. The castle's horns blared a warning that echoed through Winterfell's halls, rousing even the slumbering wounded. Men and women scrambled to positions. The tension in the courtyard was palpable, like the moments before a summer storm, but far colder, far deadlier. Later that morning, the battered survivors who had arrived recounted more details. They spoke of seeing White Walkers among the horde, possibly 3 or 4, each directing the swarm of whites. They also mentioned shapes in the sky. No one was sure what they were, perhaps night birds or monstrous shadows. A gloom hung over them, as if they'd peered into death itself. Hearing their stories, the men of Winterfell grew solemn. Some prayed, others drank to steady their nerves. The castle took on the hush of an impending funeral. Jon convened a war council with all major leaders: Tormund for the Free Folk, Lyanna Mormont for the Bear Island Knights, Lord Glover for his newly arrived men, the representative from House Serwyn, and any other head of a contingent large enough to matter. They stood around the map in the Great Hall, which had been cleared of cots for the occasion. Giants could not fit inside easily, but Pakulra stood at the doorway, stooping, with two younger giants behind her. Tormund acted as translator, yelling bits of the old tongue to keep her apprised of key points. Jon laid out the plan. Archers on the walls, as many as they could muster, including giant archers with oversized bows. They would saturate the field with flaming arrows the moment the whites emerged from range. Traps in the killing ground. Wooden stakes, hidden pits that the giants had helped to dig, lines of pitch to be set ablaze. The main gates would be barricaded behind multiple layers of defenses, and a host of wildlings and northern foot soldiers would stand by to meet any breach. Giants were to be positioned at key points along the inner walls, ready to repel whites that scaled or broke through. Cavalry was limited, but what knights they had would be stationed for flanking maneuvers, though Jon was uncertain whether they could be effective against such a mass of undead. If the White Walkers show themselves, Jon told them, we strike with Valyrian steel or dragonglass if we have it. No one faces them alone if it can be helped. We remember Hardhome, the last hearth. If they break our lines, we fall back to the inner keep. But we stand as long as we can out there. We need to kill as many whites as possible before they reach the walls. Lyanna Mormont's jaw was set. We'll hold. Bear Island stands with the north. Lord Glover looked nervous but nodded. We'll fight to the last man. Tormund folded his arms. We've done this before. We know what's coming. But now we have a fortress on our side and big folk to smash the dead. That's better odds than Hardhome. Pakulra grunted something, nodding in agreement, or so it appeared. Tormund explained she intended to put the strongest giants on the front lines to hurl boulders and break the whites' initial surge. Jon only hoped that would be enough. They broke from the council, each going to rouse their respective followers. Winterfell's courtyard became a storm of activity, forging last-minute weapons, sharpening swords, stringing bows, preparing barrels of pitch for ignition. The wounded who could walk insisted on taking part, some leaning on crutches. Others, too hurt to fight, volunteered to help carry arrows or tend the fires. Within hours, a resolute hush descended on the fortress. The living had done all they could to prepare. Now it was only a matter of when the dead appeared. A day passed with no sign. Then night came. Snow battered the ramparts, forcing men to huddle behind mantlets, their torches guttering in the fierce wind. Giants slouched near the fires in the courtyard, watchful and stoic. Dawn arrived in a pall of gray cloud cover. Another day uncertain. Scouts returned, half-frozen, reporting no sightings. Tensions wound tighter with each hour of silence. On the second night, Jon stood on the wall, scanning the darkness. Tormund was with him, as was Ser Davos. The old knight seemed lost in thought, tugging at the ends of his glove. A watchman to their left murmured that the snow was worsening. Visibility had shrunk to a few dozen yards. The stinging flakes pelted their faces. If the dead emerged in such a storm, they might be upon the gates before anyone realized. Jon peered into the blackness, recalling the dreadful hush before the White Walkers struck hard home. A pit clenched in his stomach. We can hardly see. We might have to rely on the horns, he said. Davos nodded, breath steaming. Let's hope we have time to blow them. Night stretched on, each minute like a slow heartbeat. Occasionally, someone cried out that they heard something. Others said they glimpsed movement, but it was always the wind, the swirl of snow. The watchers fought exhaustion. Giant silhouettes loomed in the courtyard, waiting. Men tried to keep warm, stamping their feet, exchanging quiet words of encouragement. Shortly before dawn, the wind took on a new sound, a keening moan that set nerves on edge. A young soldier, perched on the rampart with a horn in his gloved hands, began to shiver uncontrollably. Jon wanted to tell him to calm himself, but his own heart beat a steady drum of apprehension. Then he saw it, a faint flicker of movement at the edge of vision, like shapes sliding over the white ground. He leaned forward, squinting. More shapes, many more. He felt it in his bones before the watchers began to cry alarm. The White Walker's host had arrived. The horns blew 3 times, the sound echoing across Winterfell. Giants in the courtyard stirred, hoisting their clubs, letting out roars that rattled the windows. Men scrambled to their posts, fumbling with bowstrings, checking that the pitch was ready to be lit. Tormund clutched the hilt of his axe, eyes narrowed against the gale. Ghost, prowling behind Jon, let out a low, ominous growl. As the storm briefly parted in a gust, Jon saw them more clearly. A tide of dark, ragged forms moving across the plain, easily thousands strong. Their limbs jerked in unnatural rhythms, eyes gleaming pale. In front or among them, tall silhouettes glided, their forms reflecting the faintest hint of moonlight on icy armor. White Walkers guiding their legion. The vastness of it stunned the watchers. This was no mere raiding party. It was an army stretching across the horizon. A hush fell over the defenders, broken only by the crackle of torches. Jon drew Longclaw, its hilt reassuring in his grip. He glanced at Tormund and Davos, then shouted, "Archers, ready!" A wave of tension passed along the walls. Hundreds of bowstrings creaked, including a handful of giant archers who held monstrous bows. Some of the free folk lit arrows from brazier coals, while others waited for the range call. In the courtyard, men with torches stood near the barrels of pitch, ready to ignite them. The whites advanced with eerie silence, the only sound the crunch of their feet on snow. Jon's breath caught, just a little closer. He wanted them in effective range, but not so close that they could swarm the walls instantly. Then a horn blast cut through the night, a single note from the watchtower. Jon gave the order, "Loose!" Arrows streaked out, some aflame, arcing into the gloom. The front ranks of whites shuddered under the assault. Many fell, pinned or burning. A giant archer's arrow was the size of a small spear, impaling multiple whites at once. Yet the undead never slowed. More advanced over the fallen, climbing bodies as if they were stepping on stones. Again, Jon bellowed, "Loose!" Another volley. Again, whites dropped by the dozens, but the horde pressed inexorably forward, filling the gaps. A faint shrieking hiss rose from thousands of throats, a chorus of the dead. Tormund cursed under his breath. Davos, white-knuckled, signaled the next stage. Men along the walls ignited pitch-soaked bundles and hurled them into the gloom. Fire blossomed across the killing field, forcing the whites to surge around the flames, but that hardly slowed them for long. When the undead throng reached the first line of sharpened stakes, they impaled themselves without hesitation. The front ranks were skewered, forming a grisly barrier, but more whites clambered over the bodies, snapping the stakes or prying them aside. As soon as they found a gap, the horde poured through, unstoppable. The watchers rained more arrows, but the target was too numerous, too relentless. Below, Jon could see giants preparing for the onslaught at the gates. Pakolra stood at the head, barking in the old tongue. A moment later, half a dozen giants stooped to grasp enormous stones. With roars that shook the snow, they hurled these rocks at the approaching mass of whites, smashing entire swaths of undead into pulped remains. But for every group destroyed, more scuttled forward. The swarm was countless, the night itself given flesh. Then came a keening screech that pierced the thunder of battle. Jon glanced upward in horror, heart lurching. Far above the battlefield, a shape moved against the clouds, the faint outline of wings in the gloom. A blast of frigid blue light lit the sky for an instant, followed by the roar of something monstrous. The undead dragon. The stories Tormund told had spoken of a dragon turned by the Night King, an unholy terror that breathed not fire, but freezing death. Men on the walls gasped. The shape vanished behind swirling clouds, only to reappear further off, circling. Some cried out, pointing, weapons trembling. Jon felt a spike of dread. If the dead commanded a dragon, no wall would remain safe for long. But there was no time to dwell on it. The whites reached the outskirts of Winterfell's defenses, swarming the moat and the open ground. Men tossed torches to ignite the pitch trenches. Flames erupted, forming a ring of fire that temporarily halted part of the undead wave. Whites caught in it burned, flailing with awful screeches. But soon others found ways around, climbing over bodies or pressing toward the main gate. The battle lines blurred. "Giants, hold the gate!" Jon called from the wall, though his voice was nearly lost in the cacophony. He motioned for another volley of arrows. "Archers, keep firing!" Bolts rained down, and the giant archers launched their massive arrows with devastating impact. Whites toppled in droves. But the dead had no fear, no sense of self-preservation. They scurried like insects, piling high against the walls, clawing and scratching. Some brandished weapons, rusted swords, spears, axes. The defenders hurled stones, boiling oil, anything to keep them from scaling the ramparts. Below, the main gate shuddered under the combined push of hundreds of whites. Giants on the inside braced against it, each footfall shaking the earth. Whites battered the doors with incredible force, occasionally latching onto a giant's arm if it reached through to strike. Each time, the giant reeled back, roaring in pain. Blood and frost stained the threshold. Up on the ramparts, Tormund hacked at a white that clambered over the parapet, severing its head. Another lunged at him, and he kicked it back into the night. Men around him struggled to keep the undead from gaining a foothold. Davos manned a brazier, lighting arrows for archers who shot them point-blank into writhing corpses. The swirl of snow, flame, and blood made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Screams echoed from every direction. Jon alternated between slashing at any white that gained the wall and shouting orders to keep the lines intact. He glimpsed Ghost barreling past, jaws snapping at undead limbs. Then, a thunderous crash shook the masonry beneath his feet. Down in the courtyard, part of the gate splintered. Whites poured through the breach, shrieking. Giants met them with howls, clubs crushing entire clumps of undead. But more and more poured in. "Fall back," Jon bellowed. "To the second barrier." A line of men near the courtyard retreated behind a wooden palisade they had erected as a fallback point. Giants retreated a few steps as well, though one battered giant, pinned by whites clinging to its shoulders, collapsed with a Fina. Elroar. The undead swarmed it. Within moments, it was lost under a mass of pale arms. The rest of the giants fought savagely. Pakolra swung a massive axe, each blow destroying a knot of whites. Another giant hefted a flaming tree trunk, swinging it in wide arcs, scattering burning corpses. But the horde was vast, unstoppable. For each white destroyed, two more appeared behind it. The living ranks thinned. Some of the defenders withdrew deeper into Winterfell's yard, regrouping behind barricades. Others were cut off or cornered. The night was an endless roar of steel, flames, and desperate cries. Jon made his way down from the wall, rejoining the fight in the courtyard. He called for Tormund, but it was impossible to hear anything. Whites lunged at him from all sides. Longclaw glimmered with each strike, severing dead flesh. He felt claws rake his cloak, teeth snap near his ear. He kicked a white aside, stabbed another, pressed on. Near the base of the keep, Lyanna Mormont and her Bear Island knights held a small formation, spears bristling. Whites battered against their shields, but the knights held firm, fighting with grim determination. Jon slipped in beside them, slashing two whites off Lyanna's shield. She grunted in acknowledgement, her teeth bared in a ferocious snarl. A moment later, a giant lurched in from the right, covering their flank with a sweep of its club that crushed a half-dozen whites into paste. Across the courtyard, Tormund led a knot of wildlings, hacking a path toward the gate. Lord Glover's men were scattered, attempting to regroup near the stables. Fires burned uncontrolled, the heat clashing with the bitter cold of winter and the stink of rotting bodies. Overhead, that undead dragon screeched again, spitting shards of blue flame that soared across the sky and exploded against distant walls. Stone cracked and showered the yard in debris. Men and giants alike cried out, some pinned beneath rubble. A tremor ran through the ground. Jon nearly lost his footing. In the swirling gloom, he saw a white walker striding across the field of carnage, frost clinging to its armor. Its eyes shone like sapphires, surveying the battle with icy disdain. With a silent gesture, it raised an arm, and some of the fallen corpses, men who had died only moments before, jerked upright, ready to tear apart former comrades. An Umber's soldier turned white lunged at a man he had stood beside just minutes earlier, forcing him to put the corpse down with a trembling spear. Jon felt fury burn in his chest. He beckoned to the men around him. "We have to kill it," he growled, pointing at the White Walker. Lyanna Mormont nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. They advanced, carving through the whites that closed in to protect their master. The walker spotted them, turning its head sharply. A swirl of icy mist formed around it. Its spear, forged of some crystalline substance, gleamed wickedly in the flame's reflection. As the group neared, the walker unleashed a barrage of movements, far faster than any living swordsman. It skewered a bare island knight through the chest, hoisted him high, then tossed him aside like a broken doll. Another wildling slashed at it, but the walker shattered his blade with a single parry. Icy shards bit into the man's face. He fell screaming. Lyanna thrust her spear at the creature's flank, but it glided away, quick as a viper. Jon rushed in, longclaw raised, the Valyrian steel shining. The walker recognized the blade at once. Its lip curled in a silent hiss. They exchanged blows, sword against ice spear. Sparks flew, the clash of magic and steel jolting through Jon's arms. He barely blocked a lethal thrust, twisting aside to keep his footing on the slick ground. Lyanna tried to flank the walker, forcing it to pivot. The creature swung its spear at her, forcing her back. A third fighter, a wildling, charged with a dragonglass axe. The walker speared him clean through, a fractal crack spreading across the black blade as it clattered to the ground. The wildling slid off the spear, lifeless. The walker advanced again, each step leaving a faint rime of frost on the stone. Jon snarled, smashing Longclaw against the walker's weapon in a powerful overhead blow. Ice cracked. The walker staggered, letting out an unearthly shriek. Seizing the chance, Jon lunged. The walker jerked aside, but the blade caught its arm, slicing through frosted armor. A thin wisp of swirling vapor escaped, like escaping frost. The walker recoiled, stepping back, glowering at Jon with malevolent eyes. Before Jon could strike again, fresh whites surged between them, nearly knocking him over. Lyanna and another Bear Island knight fought to clear a path. The White Walker, free of immediate danger, raised its spear. With a sweeping motion, it commanded more of the fallen to rise. Corpses twitched around them. Jon chopped through a newly risen wight, cursing as the parted body kept moving. The courtyard was drowning in undead. He lost sight of the walker for a moment, pinned down by a furious assault of wights. Bones and frozen flesh hammered at his shield, tried to wrench away his sword. He battered them off, stabbing and cutting, each kill leaving him more exhausted. The stench of death pressed on him. Around him, allies fought and fell. Giants roared in the distance, the ground shaking whenever they struck. Suddenly, a giant crashed across Jon's line of sight, battered by dozens of wights clinging to its limbs. The creature stumbled, flailing. It smashed into a portion of the wall, fracturing stone. A moment later, the giant toppled with a thunderous impact, crushing living and dead beneath it. Jon dove aside, barely escaping being flattened. Debris showered him. By the time he scrambled to his feet, the press of wights had shifted. He heard someone yelling his name, recognized Tormund's voice, but couldn't see him. The turmoil was too intense. Then, amid the swirling chaos, a deeper roar boomed, cutting through the bedlam. Giant horns? He turned, seeing Pakulra, the Rock Mother, standing near the collapsed gate. She lifted her massive axe overhead, bellowing something in the old tongue. The younger giants joined her in a resounding cry. In unison, they smashed their weapons into the wave of undead that threatened to overrun the courtyard, crushing wights faster than they could rise. It offered the defenders a few precious moments to regroup and push forward again. Jon spied the White Walker re-emerging from behind a mound of corpses. It held its spear at the ready, scanning for the man with Valyrian steel. Jon locked eyes with it across the churned snow. He tightened his grip on Longclaw. The air tingled with unnatural cold as they slowly closed the distance. Each step Jon took felt weighted by the stakes of the entire battle. The walker lunged first, spear whistling. Jon parried, the impact numbing his arm. He countered, feinting to draw the walker's guard aside. Their weapons rang out in high, crystalline echoes that vibrated in Jon's teeth. A ghostly mist trailed every move of the walker's spear. It was fast, inhumanly so, and each strike threatened to freeze the very air Jon breathed. He fought with desperate skill, harnessing every ounce of training from Castle Black, the battles beyond the wall, Hardhome, and beyond. The memory of how he had once slain another walker fueled him. Somewhere to the right, Lyanna Mormont tried to assist, but was forced back by wights that seemed to protect their master. Another flurry of slashes nearly disarmed Jon. He reeled, feeling the edge of the spear slice across his thigh, cold slicing deeper than steel. He bit back a cry, staggering. The walker advanced, pressing its advantage. With a savage effort, Jon mustered enough strength to block the next blow, but his arms trembled. The creature sneered, a silent expression of triumph. Yet in that moment, a blur of movement erupted behind the walker. A giant, badly wounded, launched itself forward, arm outstretched. It was the same giant who had once helped Jon slay another walker near the last hearth. Its leg now wrapped in fresh bandages, face twisted in defiance. The giant roared, sweeping a huge stone mallet downward. The walker spun too late. The mallet caught it across the back, flinging it forward directly into Jon's range. Jon, seizing the opportunity, raised Longclaw and drove it down with every scrap of strength left. The blade crashed into the walker's chest. A screech, like ice fracturing under great pressure, ripped through the air. The walker's form split in a web of cracks, and with a final shrill wail, it shattered into shards of frosty mist. The giant's mallet whooshed harmlessly through the empty space, scattering what remained of the creature into the wind. In an instant, the walker was gone. Exhausted, Jon nearly collapsed to his knees. The giant let out a triumphant roar that rattled the courtyard, echoing off Winterfell's walls. Men nearby, seeing the walker's demise, raised a cheer, though it was a raw, ragged sound. Some wights in the immediate vicinity twitched and fell, severed from the walker's power. Still, the larger horde pressed on, likely guided by other white walkers scattered across the field. Jon caught his breath, pressing a hand to the bleeding wound on his thigh. The cold sting alarmed him, but he forced himself upright. "Thank you," he gasped to the giant, who panted, leaning heavily on its mallet. The giant gave a low rumble of acknowledgement, though it was wounded again, one arm hanging limp. It turned to rejoin the fight, smashing another knot of wights that lurched forward. Though that White Walker was destroyed, the battle raged across Winterfell. Clashes echoed in every corner. Men shrieking, giants bellowing, wights rattling their death cries. Atop the walls, archers still loosed arrows whenever they found a target. Some ramparts had fallen, overrun by undead who now spilled into the upper corridors. A few fires burned out of control, turning the night sky orange in places. The snow melted where the flames licked, then refroze into slick puddles. Icy shards lay everywhere, evidence of each White Walker or wight destroyed. Jon staggered across the yard to rejoin the defenders. He found Tormund near the stables, blood soaking his furs. The wildling's grin was savage, though his eyes flashed with adrenaline. "You still alive, Snow?" he bellowed, cutting a wight in half. "Good. Barely," Jon answered. "How do we stand?" "Poorly," Tormund snapped. "But we're still standing. The dead outnumber us 5-1, maybe more. We lost half our men, maybe more, but the big folk keep smashing them. If it goes on much longer, though, we'll be overrun." Jon looked around, heart sinking at the grim truth. Even with giants and walls, their lines were fraying. The undead swarmed in pockets, unstoppable. They needed a miracle. "We hold as long as we can," he said. "We try to find the other White Walkers. Kill them if possible. That might scatter the Whites." Tormund nodded, though hope was faint in his eyes. Then he pointed upward. "Look! High above!" A shape streaked across the sky, illuminated by the glow of fires. For a moment, Jon thought it was the undead dragon returning. But then the shape roared, not with an unearthly screech, but with the thunderous bellow of living flame. An orange glow erupted, streaming from a massive maw. Another dragon, and in its wake, a second winged beast soared. The sky lit with fiery arcs. Even through the haze, Jon recognized them. Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, or so it seemed. The cavalry he'd scarcely dared hope for. A cheer rose among the defenders, a note of astonished relief. Giants looked skyward, some startled, others letting out roars of their own. The first living dragon banked, unleashing a torrent of flame that seared across a portion of the undead throng outside Winterfell's walls. The Whites shrieked, igniting like tinder. Another blast from the second dragon hammered into the lines near the open gate, clearing a swath in seconds that had taken men hours to defend. Jon felt a wild surge of hope. Reinforcements had come, if only in some capacity. The swirling snow parted enough to reveal a small host of mounted figures galloping behind the dragon's fire. Whether they were Dothraki, Unsullied, or another band loyal to Daenerys, he could not tell. But their torches blazed as they struck the exposed flank of the undead host. For the first time all night, the Whites reeled under this surprise assault. "7 hells?" Tormund breathed, grinning. "Maybe we won't die just yet, Snow." Jon sheathed Longclaw for a moment, letting relief wash over him. But the battle was far from won. The undead dragon still lurked somewhere in the storm, and thousands of Whites remained within the castle walls. Even so, the arrival of living dragons turned the tide. If Daenerys herself was among them, they might coordinate enough to crush the White Walkers from both sides. "We press on," Jon shouted to the men around him. "Fight them back. We're not alone now." A ragged chorus of cheers answered him. Giants bellowed, men advanced, attempting to push the Whites back out of the courtyard or trap them against the barricades. Flaming arrows rained from above as the living dragons circled again, spouting jets of fire that licked at the edges of the fortress. The light was blinding against the snowstorm, creating a surreal tableau of orange flame against white and gray. Jon, limping from his wound, forced himself forward. Another White Walker might be nearby, or the Night King himself could be out there orchestrating the assault. He had to be found and slain, or all of this would be for naught. Yet the chaos made it nearly impossible to locate anyone. Whites fought in every corner, climbing walls, bursting into corridors, tearing through stables. Giants thundered about, smashing or burning clusters of undead. The living dragons overhead swooped closer, scorching any large concentrations of Whites they spotted. Suddenly, a new quake shook the yard. Jon saw to his left that the undead dragon had reappeared, diving from above. Its roar was unlike any living creature, an unholy cacophony that froze the blood. Blue flame spewed from its maw, colliding with one of Daenerys' dragons mid-flight. A cataclysmic burst of energy lit the night sky. The living dragon shrieked, twisting away. The two behemoths grappled, snapping at each other with jaws of teeth and ice. Their roars thundered above the battlefield, overshadowing even the cries of men. In the confusion, the ground battle raged on, overshadowed by the aerial duel. Jon found himself locked in a desperate melee near the Great Hall, hacking at Whites that spilled from the entry. Tormund and a group of wildlings flanked him, each man consumed by the savage moment. Lyanna Mormont appeared at his side, battered but alive, leading a half-dozen Mormont knights. A giant swung a broken timber, clearing a path. They forged onward, step by agonizing step, reclaiming ground from the dead. Fires sprang up behind them, courtesy of flung torches or spilled pitch. The courtyard became a labyrinth of flame and ice. Above, the dragons crashed into each other again, rolling across the sky in a tangle of wings and tails. Sparks rained down whenever their fiery breaths clashed. Finally, the undead dragon broke off, battered but not destroyed, black ichor dripping from rents in its dead flesh. The living dragon unleashed a torrent of flame, but the undead beast soared higher, twisting out of range. Daenerys's other dragon, if indeed that was what it was, circled from behind, hoping to trap the abomination in a crossfire. For a few moments, it seemed the living might triumph in the air. The undead dragon roared again, exhaling an icy blast that enveloped part of Winterfell's outer rampart. Stone cracked and shattered beneath the unearthly cold, toppling in a thunderous collapse. Defenders stationed there vanished in a rush of rubble. Jon and the others felt the tremor ripple underfoot. Screams tore through the night. Giants near that wall stumbled, some crushed by falling debris. The entire fortress threatened to break beneath the combined wrath of monstrous powers. Still, the living pressed on, refusing to yield. They had no choice. Either they continued the fight or they died. In the courtyard, the arrival of Daenerys's ground forces slowly turned the tide. They hacked at the whites from the rear, forcing them into a deadly crossfire with men and giants inside the walls. Corpses piled high, blocking passages. The stench was overpowering. Yet the whites did not retreat unless commanded by a White Walker. And so the brutal slog continued, each side paying in blood and bone for every inch. At last, dawn began to break, revealing the carnage in stark relief. The snowstorm persisted, swirling around the fortress, but weak sunlight pierced through in thin rays. Fires still burned in places, sending columns of smoke heavenward. The moans of wounded men, the rasp of battered giants, and the crackle of flames were the only sounds for a moment, until a ragged cheer went up from a group near the gate. The living had driven out the last pocket of whites from the courtyard, cornering them against the battered remains of the main doors. A swirl of blackened bones and rags collapsed under the combined assault. Giants heaved, panting. Men sank to their knees in relief. But the victory inside Winterfell's yard did not mean the undead were gone. Countless whites, perhaps, still lingered outside or within the keep's corridors. White Walkers might still roam the outskirts. The undead dragon circled overhead, locked in a cat-and-mouse struggle with Daenerys's pair. Everywhere Jon looked, the fortress was shattered. Walls collapsed, towers half-crumbled, the ground littered with bodies. He saw no sign of the Night King, though. Perhaps the foe waited, observing. Or perhaps he had no need to reveal himself yet. Jon limped through the courtyard, calling for Tormund, Davos, Lyanna, whoever he could find. Soldiers emerged from behind broken barricades, blinking in the smoky dawn. Giants stooped over their fallen kin, some letting out keening bellows that echoed heartbreak. The cost was staggering, yet they had not fallen. Winterfell still stood. He spotted Davos, leaning against a fractured barrel, nursing a wounded arm. The old knight looked up, relief washing over his lined face when he saw Jon. "We held them off for now," Davos croaked. "But how many more are out there?" Jon didn't answer. He didn't know. Tormund appeared moments later, sporting a gash across his forehead, blood soaking his beard. He gave Jon a fierce grin. "You're still alive. That's good, because I want my feast when this is done." Jon managed a hoarse laugh, though the weight of the devastation nearly crushed him. "We have to press the advantage, see if we can finish them." "Where's Daenerys?" A woman's voice answered from behind him. "Here." Jon turned to see her. Daenerys Targaryen herself, limping slightly, soot smudging her cheeks, strands of silver blonde hair escaping her hood. She stood with a small cluster of Unsullied, who looked as battered as everyone else. Her eyes locked with Jon's, and for a heartbeat, They shared the exhaustion of two souls who had sacrificed everything for one last stand. "You arrived just in time," Jon said, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." She inclined her head, struggling for composure. "We did what we could, but the undead dragon is still out there, and I saw white walkers in the distance." She breathed hard, as if every word cost her. "The Night King hasn't shown himself to me, but he must be near." Tormund spat at the ground. "Then we find the bastard. End this." They all knew the battle was not truly over. The living might have won this round, but the threat of the Night King and his endless horde remained. Winterfell was in ruins, its defenders on the brink of collapse. Giants lay strewn in the yard, some dead, some wounded, others blinking in shock. Men stumbled like the walking dead themselves, half frostbitten, clothes soaked in blood. And overhead, the dragons roared, continuing their deadly aerial dance. But for now, for this moment, the living had not yielded. Jon exchanged a look with Daenerys, with Tormund, with Davos. Nearby, Lyanna Mormont limped over, leaning on a broken spear. A cluster of men from different houses formed a rough circle, uncertain but defiant. The courtyard stank of death, yet the living still drew breath. Giants rumbled in the background, stooping to help each other stand. It was a sight Jon would never forget. Men, women, wildlings, giants, and now Daenerys' forces, all standing in battered unity against the darkness. A dream beyond all reason. Jon lifted Longclaw, bracing it against the churned snow. "We've come this far," he rasped. "We'll finish this, together." No one cheered. No one had the strength. But the set of their shoulders, the glint in their eyes, the unspoken vow, they would not break now. Dawn's weak light painted the scene in pale gold. The wind howled, carrying with it the final echoes of the night's slaughter. The living had survived, and though the battle for Winterfell was not yet finished, a fierce, unwavering hope burned amid the ruins. Here in the north, men and giants had stood shoulder to shoulder, and for one desperate night, they had held against the endless tide of death. In that shared stand, perhaps they had found the only power strong enough to challenge the long night. Their unyielding alliance, forged in blood and flame, and with dragons now at their side, they might yet turn the tide once and for all.